Hello, good afternoon, everybody. For those who are joining from Singapore, and of course, good morning, good evening for friends, who are joining from the other part of the world. My name is Ani Febriastati, and I'm the Associate Director of Executive Education Singapore Futures team here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And together with my team, we welcome you back to the second season and episode 6 of the Futures Forward webinar. And today's topic is on the futures of food. Makes me very hungry because, we are in between work hours and dinner hours, of course. While waiting for, more participants to stream in, I would like to invite, those who have joined us to say hi and type in the chat. And of course, tell us, where you are now, where you're dialing from. Hi. It looks like we have Oh, hello, Anne. Hello, Ting Chu. Of course, Madhu from Singapore. And we've got somebody logging in from Perth. Hello, Cheryl. Hello, Roberto. Hi, Chesha. Hi, Daniel. I wonder if it is raining in Manila or Philippines. Because it's been quite rainy here in Singapore. All right. I'm happy to see the participants' numbers. We have more people streaming in. And let's start then. Hi, Marjorie. Oh dear, I hope there's no storm or any, forecasted weather disaster coming. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for sharing where you're logging in from. And I hope everyone is keeping well and staying safe from the, as much as we hope that COVID is away, but it sounds like the numbers are still there, not just in Singapore, but also, in the countries in the region. If I could get the next slides, please. Today, we are very lucky on the topic of futures of food. We are joined by a wonderful moderator and a stellar panelist. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Chang Hong Cho. He is a research fellow from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. His main research interests includes regional and global resources, conflicts and governance, game theory, discourse analysis, emerging technologies. And of course, one of the books that he authored was on securing rice bowl, China and global food security. This is very much relevant to the conversation that we will have today. We also have Madhumita Adanari, Principal Sustainability Strategies and Futurist from the Forum for the Future. She is a change designer, researcher, facilitators. Wow, you wear so many hats, Madhu. Passionate about areas such as labor rights, radical decarbonizations, and food justice. Again, that explains why she's here on the topic of futures of food. She currently leads the forums shaping the future of responsible recruitment and protein challenge, Southeast Asia programs, and this is focusing on systemic outcomes such as smallholder justice, regenerative agriculture, and improving regional biodiversity. I must say that we might have, a more a deeper conversation around agriculture later on, and I'm pretty sure it will be a very thought-provoking and interesting conversation. And we also have Chi Zekin, co-founder of City Sprouts, a social enterprise where they rejuvenate urban spaces and develop educational programs, bringing together socially minded individuals and businesses to create communicates that inform, educate, and support action on social and environmental issues. Welcome, to all the three panelists. And of course, this webinar wouldn't be possible without our friend who will moderate the conversation today, Luke Tay, founder of Cornucopia Futurescapes, and of course, our own fellow, Executive Education Singapore Futures Fellow here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Of course, Luke leads a globally oriented foresight and strategy consultancy with a focus on food security, food, energy, water, and sustainability nexus, technology, and geopolitics. Of course, he's working with corporates, institutions, governments, universities, and international organizations as he advises on emerging issues, scenario, strategic opportunities, and support foresight capability development. He speaks and writes at a range of international sustainability, foresight, entrepreneurship, and innovation platforms. Now, I do not want to do all the talking. I think it is with great pleasure for me to invite Luke to lead the conversation this evening. Luke, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ani, for that introduction of everyone. So you've made my job easier. In fact, so let's really jump in. I don't know who was that strange last person you're introducing, but let me really quickly dive into the topic of food. Food obviously is existential. Maybe we can have a show of hands in the audience who hasn't eaten in the last 1 year. 7 months is over, but so we all eat, and so food is existential. Food is economic, cultural. If we are futurists, we've probably heard of the mnemonic pestle, politics, economics, and so on. So really food is across the board, besides being an enterprise and an act of chemistry and interaction with the earth. So it's fundamental. And I think that hence there's a lot of concern about where we are now. I can rattle off lots of statistics and not so fun facts really, but just to paint in a broad brush, what's up right now. I think that, for various reasons, primarily the ongoing conflict in Europe, the food prices are up, although they're down recently, but up something like 15 to 30% on where they were last year. Food insecurity had already been rising. I think by some stats, there are 50 million more people this year in severe hunger. And if you draw the trajectory, 20 million more on the way. As a social scientist myself, I also wonder about the ripple effects in terms of, national stability, in some threatened countries, for instance, So weather extremes, I think we are going through a summer of discontent and disruption, be it in East Asia, in Europe, in America. So it seems like the climate emergency is really coming to bite, where the fact it is there is beyond dispute, and the effects are really being felt through various systems, including food. Disease, I think we can go on, beyond just COVID. A lot of diseases that maybe more pinhead types will really know about unless it hits you as a consumer, are out there, plant diseases as well, and so on. So if you just look at all this, it's really daunting and a bit depressing. And there's the oft-repeated statistic that by 2050, we have something like north of 9 billion people, to feed. And maybe production has to go up something like 2x, So that's one way to look at things, but I think that we are here to have nuance and dimension to the conversation. So in fact, is this the worst of times, or is this the best of times for potential breakthroughs as well? I would say that because of all the above, people, all the stakeholders in the system are far more food aware than they were before. There's a lot of ferment. Certainly on the agri-tech side, if you read the Straits Times, every day, every other day, there'll be news of alternate proteins. And in fact, we'll go into that. and other aspects of food sector adaptation, digitization, remote delivery, and so on. Focus on food as medicine, food nutrition, food and mental health, the people sector really getting involved. And again, we'll talk about that, and efflorescence of capital, backing new ventures. And Singapore is one note of that. And we really are looking at the region and the world. So it's a very mixed picture. It's a very unclear picture. And that's why we have this panel, to see where we are, but really look at the trajectories moving forward, across the food security scape, looking at production and also at new tech breakthroughs and really stringing all that together. And I think the key thing I want to leave with you as we begin to hear from the speakers is that the point is things aren't great, but we have agency. But what do we do with it? What future narratives, what futures can we imagine? And hopefully that will come out from the session. So without further ado, let's plunge in, and may I hand you over to my friend, Dr. Chang Hong Cho, to share his take on food security and the regional situation. Hong Cho?
Thank you very much, Anna, for a very nice introduction. Thank you very much, Luke, for the invitation and for organizing this panel. And as a recent graduate of ALKV school, it's such a proud moment to be back here. So for my sharing section, I will just briefly talk about 3 main points. The first is the current state of global food security. We are in a crisis for sure. And then I will focus on the 4 main factors that trigger the crisis and that continue to fuel this crisis. And then in the last part, I will discuss how this crisis is reshaping the global food system and what can be done to improve it. And then let me just move on to give you a few numbers about the current situation of global food security. So as we all know right now, the world is facing a major food crisis. And then according to the latest estimate by the World Food Program, as many as 828 million people go to bed hungry every night. And about 50 million across nearly 50 countries are on the edge of famine. And in addition, with the recent rise in the food prices, more people are driven to extreme poverty, which magnifies hunger and malnutrition. So as the latest estimate indicates, by June 2022, the number of acute food insecure people has reached 345 million. That was a shocking jump from 135 just 3 years ago. And then this ongoing global food crisis is triggered and continue to be fueled by several key factors, most notably COVID-19, climate shocks, conflicts, and government intervention. I will briefly discuss these factors in turn. The first is COVID-19. With removal of the mandatory mask rules, we might start to feel that COVID-19 is over. But as Anna Luke has reminded us that it's not, because the cases are rising. And then there are also a lot of other questions that remain unanswered. We don't know whether a new variant emerge, and no one will predict how this situation will end. And then over the past 2 years, due to COVID, disruptions in agriculture labor availability, negative impacts on the entire food supply chains, and prompted widespread food insecurity concerns. Surveys by World Bank indicate that a significant number of people across 85 countries run out of food or reducing their consumptions in the first 2 years of COVID. Then the next factor is climate shocks. Extreme climate events has brought major disruptions and uncertainties to global food production. A rapidly changing climate is making agriculture more vulnerable and unpredictable. In the late 2020, the Eastern Horn of Africa has experienced persistent extreme drought, and extremely dry weather has resulted in significant reductions in agricultural output, causing food shortages throughout the region. Right now, in the Northern Hemisphere, climate shocks are seen across the continent. Massive flood in Pakistan, Europe experiencing its worst drought in 500 years, as some suggest, and in China, recorded heat waves, and then which has led the world's third largest river, the Yangtze River, to its lowest level since 1961. And then something similar things are happening in America as well. So these extreme climate events are posing severe threat to local and global production, global food systems, exacerbating food insecurity situations across the regions. And then the third one is conflicts. Most notably, and Luke also mentioned about it, Russia-Ukraine war. Conflict has been the biggest driver of hunger. Research has found out that 60% of the world's population, or hungry population, live in areas affected by war and violence. For instance, just within this region, with the Myanmar's military coup last year, and then the continued military conflicts, it was estimated by the World Food Program that 1 in 4, or 13.2 million people in the country in Myanmar are suffering from food insecurity. And then, of course, we had mentioned about Russian-Ukraine war, which two countries together supply to 30% of world wheat. And then many of the so-called most vulnerable and impoverished countries depends on these two countries for wheat supplies. And since the war, global wheat price has surged by more than 60% as it peaked. Thankfully, it went down a little bit, but the rising food prices had exacerbated food insecurity in many of the poor African and Asian countries. And then the fourth one is the trade distorting measures. Confronted with these disruptions caused by climate change, COVID, and conflicts, many countries had reacted with various policy interventions, ranging from financial support to boost domestic production to trade distorting policies. For instance, right after the war in Ukraine, there was an alarming global surge in government controls in the export of food. There were several very notable examples happened around us. India's ban on wheat, Indonesia's brief ban of palm oil, and then of course we have Malaysia's ban of chicken, which has severely affected food supplies here as well. And then history tells us that such restrictions are counterproductive in most tragic ways. And then if you just simply look at what happened in the decade in 2007 and 2008, these measures had exacerbated and triggered the food crisis back then. And now, let me just move on to the second part of my talk, the future of food governance. Amid this current global food crisis, scholars and policymakers are reconsidering the state of world food governance system and then the viability of trade-based food security strategies. As far as food governance is concerned, it is often analyzed through the lens of food region, which is widely adopted to understand how system of production, distribution, and consumption of food are integrated in a manner that both reflect and support global cycle or capital accumulation. Over the past decades, there were two seemingly competing paradigms. The first one is the neoliberal food regime, and then the second one is food sovereignty that has emerged. The first represents a hegemonic assertion of neoliberal economic rationalism, where food sovereignty is the opposition and populist social movement that aim to achieve national and local self-sufficiency. While neoliberal food regimes have been a dominant paradigm, food sovereignty has also gained momentum in recent years, thanks to both strong bottom-up initiative and growing top-down efforts. The current global food crisis, which has further exposed some of the deep-rooted weaknesses of the neoliberal food regime and the risks associated with trade-oriented food security strategy, has further tipped the balance in favor of food sovereignty and localized food systems. Countries around the world right now have realized the importance of domestic production, and then more emphasis on more financial policy support has introduced to boost local productions and also began to search for alternative source of proteins. And looking forward to build a better food system, I think the following actions are needed. The first one is that the global food trade will remain and need to be included as part of the answer to global security, because research has shown that Although our effort to boost local productions will help, but it can only meet the demand for less than 1/3 of the population. For many food importing countries, domestic production alone will not be enough. Furthermore, due to globalization of food, diet, resource, and climate constraints, many food importing countries will not be able to produce all the diverse food items that they consume. Take wheat, for example, in Southeast Asia. No matter how hard we try, due to the climate concerns, there's very little prospect for major increase in local wheat production. And then the second is at the societal level, more attention has to be given to food security situations of the disadvantaged group, including poor, vulnerable, and displaced peoples. In the rural area, the best way to safeguard food security is revitalize agriculture and food production. And then in the cities, government at all levels should work together to establish appropriate social protection system. Third, at a national level, while more capital flows should be direct to agriculture sector to boost production, effort also needed to strengthen the resilience of external food supplies. Food importing countries need to pursue and continue to pursue the strategy of diversification to minimize the external food shocks. And then finally, at the international level, global agriculture production, rather than imposing trade distorting measures, more cooperation is needed, and also more resource effort are needed in terms of boosting research and development. And more importantly, the crisis has highlighted the role that the need for a global and regional reserve system. And in a word, I think the current global crisis has shown that the global system needs to become a more resilient one. And with that, I will stop here.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Hong Zhou. I think that you really put a lot on the table and help us with exposition on the situation that the region and the world finds ourselves in. One of my key takeaways really is how you oppose this neoliberal type of hegemonic, like basically a project of elites, versus a project from the grassroots, so to speak, of the people. So I guess that's one thing that we can bounce the ball on and see, is there maybe a synthesis, as part of the future of food moving forward. So really, let's hear now from my friend Madhu. She's from Forum of the Future. She has an exciting project to share, but I think way more than that, from her overall humanities background, and also talking about discontinuities. So Madhu, over to you to share your thoughts.
Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Dr. Zhang. It was really great to hear sort of this broad trends and drivers that are shaping the global food system that will invariably affect Asia, and how the terms of trade and the structures that are created around how food functions and is produced, traded, and consumed. My presentation is very much focused on, well, I'm a sustainability futurist, so naturally a lot of my focus is, Dr. Zhang talked about climate realities, but I'm looking at the wider systemic systems of sustainability and how they're affecting our food system. So my organization, Forum for the Future, works on understanding how deep transitions can happen in specific areas where there's a lot of catalytic action happening. So food is one big area, energy is another area that we're looking at, and of course the role of markets and business is a third area we look at. I lead the program on food in Southeast Asia, and our focus is on protein. So that's where I have the most experience and expertise to talk about. Protein is an interesting space because Dr. Zhang and Luke have talked a lot about food security as a critical issue. A lot of our basic nutritional needs in the region are still not met for a lot of people with the kind of economic disparities that we are seeing. Yet there's a lot of innovation in the protein space. So if Dr. Zhang has set out some of the certainties, like the realities we need to grapple with, this is a space that's quite dynamic. It's moving and it's shifting, and a lot of change is happening. And the Singaporean government has been investing so much money, R&D, and all sorts of investments into the alternative protein space. So it's from an organizational point of view, if we are asking a question of what is a deep transition, protein is a space that's in transition, and what we are seeing is a risk of shallow transitions. What do we mean by that? we have a lot of these kinds of innovations that are very focused on specific things. They're focused on saying we are not meat and therefore we are a lot better because we are either carbon neutral or have a much lower carbon footprint. If we want them to be the best solutioning actors or the things that of the future, what can we, if we can imagine that, if we can envision that, what can that look like? And that's really what the work that I'm doing is how can we bring some of these catalyzing forces to imagine a much more ambitious future around how sustainable we can be. And what we are seeing in Southeast Asia, because the scope of our work looks at Southeast Asia, and our region, Southeast Asia as a region, is so focused on its water systems. Our key exports, whether it's rice or whether it's seafood, rely on the flooding, the kind of annual flooding of the Mekong, and the water systems rely entirely on our wonderful biodiversity hotspot and a coral triangle that our region sits in. So there are some incredible things that are unique to our region that it's not just sustainability as a good to have, but they are fundamental linchpins of our system. And some of our concerns as doing this project and as systems thinkers is, can we make sure that emerging solutions are meeting critical systemic gaps? What are the key systemic gaps that we have identified? There are 3. One is our region is 4 out of 5 plates that we eat in the food in our system come from smallholders. Our farmers are critical, and these are largely subsistence farmers with different kind of ownership structures. But these are the people who are feeding us, yet they are not really winning in the current food system as it stands. And as we get all this explosion of new technologies, the future of our farmers is under great question. You know, if a lot of the food is not land-based anymore and is going to be, be in factories or in vertical farms, there's a question like, are our farmers being left out? And if so, how can we enable a just transition so that our protein needs are not just looking at delivering protein in terms of the quantity or yield to our people, but in a way that's healthy, good quality, and in a way that's just and fair to our farmers. So that's one. The second thing that we see as a critical gap and an uncertainty is just soil. The quality of our soil. We have been engaged in quite extractive practices. Of course, the great thing about smallholders is that we have many people, many hands feeding our bread bowl in this region. But the flip side or the shadow side of it is that it's an incredibly fragmented system, and we have lots of issues in terms of whether the most regenerative techniques are not being scaled up to all of our growers. So there is a question of how can we move from extractive agriculture towards more regenerative ways in which it's not just good for our soils, but the nutrition in the foods that we're eating. We know that the quantity of arable soil is going down. That's a certainty, but we can change that. We also know that the quality of nutrition in our foods, it's been declining slowly but quietly. And if we don't do something about it, if we don't have good microorganisms in our soil, they're not being translated in our foods. So that's a second uncertainty and systemic gap that we're trying to work with. The third one that we are seeing quite critically, and I've already pointed to this, is that we are a biodiversity hotspot. 34%, a third of our world's corals are in Southeast Asia. And at the same time, we have the lungs. We tend to think of the Amazon as the lungs, but we have the ways in which industry has grown and prospered in Southeast Asia through damming, deforestation, and dredging. These are the 3 Ds that have really, really upset our ecosystems. And if we think about it, we have incredible amounts of biodiversity. I remember I was hiking in the foothills of Mount Kinabalu, and our guide pointed us to 24 types of ginger in the forest. Similarly, the farmers that I've spoken to in Singapore talk about little crops. There's this one plant called the toothache plant that we don't really think about, but apparently it's a better spice than mala because it grows in Singapore, grows like a weed, and it's brilliant. Yet we don't know about these things. We've lost a lot of the knowledge. I'm sure Chicken is going to talk a lot about this, but we've lost a lot of this knowledge of the incredible biodiversity we have. And we have a protein and wider food system that's very consolidated. We eat the same few crops over and over again. And the same food crops are being produced by a very small number of companies that have taken up the lion's share of equity in the food supply chain, and there's a lot of wealth consolidation in the food system. So there is something about how can we encourage biodiversity and localized food systems. And again, it's a big systemic gap in how the current alternative protein system is functioning, because a lot of the feedstock going into alternative protein is soy. And we are in a region, not just in Southeast Asia, but in APAC in general, where we are very comfortable with tofu and with soy in general, and tempeh, all of these things. Yet a lot of our soy is being imported from Latin America. And soy is a deforestation monoculture crop where, in order to grow lots and lots of soy, forests are being deforested more and more. So it gets a really critical question of what are the alternative feedstocks that can be grown at scale, that's affordable, that's culturally appropriate to people. There are all of these kinds of questions that are being raised. So given these kinds of changes that we are seeing and the kinds of things, Luke made a great point. Where there is uncertainty and where there is great disruption, that's where there is an opportunity for agency to be brought in. In futures, I'm a futurist as well. One of the things we know is if something is certain, you act on it because that is the only choice you have. But when something is uncertain, you navigate. That's when you can really show some leadership. So we, as Forum for the Future, we're conveners. We are bringing together businesses, people on the ground, startups, community actors, to say, actually, there are no easy solutions for these things. There are no solutions that already exist that we can just magically scale up or accelerate. Some of these things need to be seeded into the system from scratch, because we are a region that has often been change takers rather than change makers. And this is an opportunity for us to create a food system, recreate and reproduce a food system that is right for our specific challenges, our specific beauty and realities of this region, and kind of bring us to where we need to be in a way that serves people, in a way that our food systems haven't, and in our environmental and ecosystems as well. So what I will kind of round off on is what excites me. Like I think both Dr. Zhang and I have talked about all these problems in the food system, but my work, the thing that makes me really excited is I get to interact with people in various parts of the ecosystem. I get really excited about three things: people, entrepreneurs, who are not just thinking about product placement or coming up with the next alternative protein, but working upstream with farmers, working on issues on the ground. And we've looked at people like What If Foods, Chris Langwallner. I talked to this person called Shen Ming, who is from Food for Thought, as well as Pululo. They are using waste in urban environments as feedstock for alternative proteins. So it's really incredible to see people who are coming up with new ideas, not just thinking about the next big thing, but what can they develop that solves some of the fundamental problems in our wider ecosystem. So that's one thing. Second thing that really excites me is people on the ground doing incredible work. In Singapore, we've got folks like Foodscape Collective. Of course, we've got City Sprouts. And also we've got these incredible people in other parts of the region. Like in the Philippines, there is a land sovereignty movement where farmers are fighting back to get land called Pungkalun. And similarly in the Philippines, they also in the Philippines, they have a great permaculture movement going. So there's a lot of great activating forces in different parts of the region. And finally, we tend to kind of see the big companies as the big baddies, but they have a huge opportunity in terms of scaling up solutions and also providing infrastructure and investment into the ecosystem. And two that we've seen, which are really exciting us, is one, Olam, which despite being big traders, they are really focusing and zeroing in on their smallholders and soil biodiversity and soil carbon. So that's quite interesting. Also Sodexo, who as a company that feeds hospitals, caters to hospitals and schools, they're really thinking about nutrition as a critical element, not just feeding empty calories, but they're really thinking about bringing in nutritionists to make sure that alternative proteins have low sodium, are tasty, and have high acceptability amongst audiences. So these are things that really excite me. And yeah, looking forward to working with people and seeing how we can really make the best of the protein transition that we have in the region.
Great. Wow, Madhu, that was also awesome. I think by now our table is groaning with a lot of elements there, from the macro and now connecting to, specific projects, specific companies and social groups and so on. And I think that one thing that struck us when we all met together to plan the panel is that we all come from farming backgrounds in some way, you know, and I think that's where we are transitioning to Trikin sharing about his actual, you know, farm and social enterprise, you know, but maybe I think you know, Hong Cho also rolls up his sleeve, you know, and works on farms, you know, so I think that can come out in the discussion. I'm conscious of time, you know, and there's really so much to tease out here, but I think that the evolving model really is thinking, and with the audience as well, you know, what are the, as futurists do, what are the critical uncertainties, you know, as, you know, our colleagues share, and, you know, what also might be some wild cards. And I think Madhu may have some up her sleeve as well, you know. So really to ground our discussion, real professional full-time farmer, Trikin will share with us what's going on in the urban farm neighborhood. Trikin.
Thanks, Liu. Thanks, Dr. Zhang and Madhu for sharing. Very comprehensive. I think when Liu invited me to share about the futures of food, I'm just thinking to myself, the only thing I know about food is kind of chasing what's the next trend, right? Or bubble tea, or like, I don't know what's the next big thing, but I also thought about, you know, to really understand what the future has in store for us, we kind of have to look into the past as well. So I thought maybe I'll share a bit about my own history, which I kind of shared a little bit during our pre-seminar meeting with Dr. Zhang and Madhu. So I grew up in a small town in Malaysia called Ipoh, right in between Penang and Kuala Lumpur. I do have a slight tangential kind of ancestral link to farming. My grandfather used to be a vegetable wholesaler. He has a little a farm plot, or like a little garden at the back of his house. And I think for today's sharing, you might not see the relevance now, but I really wanted to paint a picture of how I hope the future of food might look like in a very ground up, very community-based perspective. So in the little garden that he has fruit trees. He has a small orchard of bananas, papayas, chikus, rambutans, and so on. And he has herbs. And I came from a really big family. So this is my maternal grandfather. My mom has 8 siblings. And in my generation of cousins, there are like over 30 of us. So the whole family altogether, it's about 40 plus people. So, and there's only one durian tree in his backyard. And for those of you who are familiar with durian farming, durians don't all fruit at the same time. They don't all ripen at the same time. So there's always this conversation going whenever the durian tree flowers on who gets the fruit first, who gets the first fruits, and who gets to eat last. And the main way to facilitate that is always by seniority. So usually the older folks, the seniors get to eat first until, and then of course the younger ones come in later on. And my mom being the younger sibling of the 9 siblings, my family usually are the last to come in to enjoy the crumbs, so to speak. But yeah, that's so how I was brought up. We are always very intertwined with food, and food has always been a way to spark conversations, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and we are so profoundly connected to food, that the food that we consume. Another thing that I used to tell people in the little village that I grew up in is so many of us are engaged in this small scale kind of not farming, because we don't have big farms, and if you have a full-time job, so we have little gardens, and most of the people I know, my relatives, all have a little small garden patch where they grow their own herbs, they grow their own edibles, and there's always this constant bartering that goes around. So whenever I make my trips home to visit family, my mom would be the first to rise in the morning, and then she would tend to the garden. She might be harvesting, and the next thing we know, we will be making rounds to the different houses, to our relatives, to our friends, and we'll be exchanging whatever that we would be harvesting on that day. So on one day, we could be harvesting, say, 5 or 6 kilograms of tapioca, and then we would go to, say, 5 or 6 houses, and we would get bananas, we would get roselle, we would exchange our tapioca for long beans, or maybe some herbs that might be growing. And at the end of the trip, when we get home, instead of just having that 5 kilograms of tapioca, we have 5 kilograms of 6 to 7 varieties of food that's harvested on the same day. And that connection to food and that relationship that I had with food wasn't really realized. And I think I took it for granted until I came to Singapore. And nowadays, food, it's so readily available, right? With a few clicks on your phone, you get food delivered to your doorstep. And whenever we eat, as Singaporeans, we call ourselves foodie, right? And I completely appreciate the food culture, the variety and diversity of food in Singapore. But oftentimes when we put food into our mouth, the last thing that comes to mind is, where does this bowl of noodles come from? The fish balls, where do the fish, where are they farmed? Where are they processed? Where are the chives from? So these are the things that are the last to pop out in our head. We only care about taste, we care about the price of food, but rarely do we think about the livelihoods that go behind the people who farm the food, who produce and process the food and then bring it to market. And those experiences and those conversations that I have with my friends and the peers and the colleagues that I have in Singapore really made me think about, the history that I had with food and how can we, do our own parts in taking ownership. And I think ownership it's really the key focus that I really want to talk about today, because to really think about the future of food, it's to really think about taking ownership over the food system that we see today, right? And whether or not you like it, I think we would have to take ownership over our food with all the different factors that Dr. Zhang and Madhu talked about, like the climate, the climate. We talk about conflict. We talk about food shortages and poverty, right? And more related to Singapore recently is the fresh chicken ban that we saw. So these things, whether you like it, it will impact you in one way or another, whether or not it's in the form of the price that you pay for your chicken rice, or whether or not it's the cost of your groceries rising and things like that. So what we do in City Sprouts is really to bring that to light, to see how we can provide that ownership. The one easy way that I like to describe what City Sprout does, right? It's actually quite apt to today's sharing and today's organizer. We like to call ourselves the Lee Kuan Yew in agriculture, because instead of giving ownership to regular Singaporeans in housing, we give ownership to people in gardening or farming, and we want to make it. We want to make farming and gardening. We want to debunk the myth of having green fingers. Oftentimes people think that you need green fingers and you need to be very sciencey and you need to know the ins and outs before you can start a garden. But most farmers, they start from scratch. You talk about smallholder farmers. Of course, it's a generational thing. It's a family. They pass it on and they understand how the growth cycles are and things like that. But it's also a skill that you pick up and you go trial and error. You know what works, what doesn't work in Singapore's climate, and then you keep trying. And that's what we want to encourage in City Sprouts in our interaction and interface with the communities that we work with. In City Sprouts, we have allotment gardens. That's how we hope to encourage regular residents who don't have the luxury of space at home to actually take on gardening as one way to be involved and to take ownership over their own food in a sustainable way. And the way we envision the future of food in City Sprouts, it's going to be it's going to be very local, hyper-localized, and also very circular. I think nowadays, like what Madhu talked about, the food that we consume, a bulk of it, it's not as diverse as in the past, and it's produced by a small group of people. But if we are able to plant this seed, and if every household has the ability and the ownership to grow their own food, what we would see, it's a very hyper-localized food system and also more complex. And we will be able to restore that complexity and that diversity in the food that we consume. And in that, we are also able to be more sustainable. We could think of, we could imagine a food system where there's a lot more sharing, there's a lot more resource and asset sharing among the different communities who are also engaged in this way of growing food. Of course, hopefully in the Q&A section later, we will talk a little bit more about some of the implications in really encouraging this kind of food citizenship, in encouraging small scale farming in an urban environment, things like food regulation, food safety, and also the variety that's limited because of the climate. But yeah, I think Luke will be managing that later. But yeah, I think like what Madhu shared, there's a lot of excitement in what's in store, in what we do in City Sprouts, in the events and the programs we curate. We hope to really inspire people to really rethink their relationship and their connection with food. And in that, be empowered and enabled to take action.
Yes. And, you know, thank you, Chicken, for that sharing. And in fact, you know, what came to me, you know, I think in foresight, but also in other things, branding, marketing, and so on, you know, the labels are so important, you know. So I think with a well-intentioned reason, you know, sometimes the food industry will call, you know, the delivery, you know, to the household, really the last mile, you know. But to me, as a futurist myself, I would spin it to say that truly it's the first mile, you know, if it's the people-centered food system. And I think what you're bringing up is speaks to the trend of greater participation among urban dwellers, you know, in the food system, you know, be it in terms of actual planting, or I think Madhu talked a bit about civic engagement, and I think, you know, we are pivoting to the discussion, so that will come out, you know. You mentioned Lee Kuan Yew there, and this is the Lee Kuan Yew LKY SPP, School of Public Policy, you know. So I happened to do a bit of digging on Lee Kuan Yew and farms, you know, back in the day. And interestingly, Singapore used to be quite agrarian, you know, covered with farms, self-sufficient in many areas. I think we won't go into the long food story and 30 by 30, which people can Google, you know. But the interesting thing is, back when we had lots of farms, farming is also politics, you know. LKY used to tour the rural constituencies, a lot of pictures of him during, you know, elections or out of cycle visiting. And interestingly, it would be the farm agency jeep that helped bring him in and introduce him to some of the most rural communities in Singapore. And that's because these farmers knew and trusted, you know, these farm agency, primary production department people. Yeah. So we are going into the Q&A phase right now. I hope the organizers will give us license maybe to take about 5 more minutes, since there's already been so much rich sharing from the panelists. Invite everyone to just, you know, type in your questions in the Q&A. And meanwhile, if I may, moderator's license, really just lob a few myself, you know, out there, you know. So my own mental model is also a bit too form as a food futurist of a few years, you know. So let me just let you into my mental model thinking ahead, and let's interrogate that, and let's squeeze that and pop that, you know. I think that if we look at the future of food, you know, macro to micro, you know, a few axes come to mind in terms of uncertainties, you know. One will be, I think the future of food is the future of the world for reasons I've mentioned, and because world conditions shape it a lot, right? Be it environment or geopolitical, you know. So looking ahead, you know, I think this is, can we imagine maybe, let's say, a more divided world in various ways, you know, versus a more permissive world, like, you know, just after the first Cold War, you know. And let's say if those were the two broad brush type of macro environments, you know, how do we see the future of food, you know, moving forward, if that were one of the uncertainties, you know. And I think that, and also, you know, to tease out from what Madhu mentioned, you know, so where do you see the role of technology and more, you know, shaping the environment if we are moving towards either a more divided world, and the food system needs to become food systems, perhaps to some extent, you know, or really in a more permissive condition? Where are we going? What are the uncertainties? Hong Zhou, do you want to jump in? Okay, you need to unmute, please. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for the excellent questions, and you really got me thinking I imagine the world is became more divided, or perhaps we enter a new era, new Cold War, great power competition between US and China. I think it's not really given the current situation and then the unfolding events. It seems very likely we are heading towards that direction. So if that really happened, what will happen to food? So if we recall what happened during the Cold War, I think the lessons we can learn is that at least during the Cold War from 1949 onwards, for a very long period of time, food was used was a very big part of the geopolitical instrument, especially by US being the biggest food exporter. As a part of geopolitical leverage, either to gain friends and publish enemy. I remember when I was doing my research on China's food security, and then when the big famine happened to China in 1959 and 1961, when the Chinese government decided or wanted to so-called import food from the international market, and then we just found out that there was a Western-led embargo against the communist bloc. So China was part of it. So it couldn't actually purchase enough food. I think that was the situation that happened during the Cold War. I think similar things also happened in many parts of the world. When you are allies with US, and then you're much easier to either receive food aids or buy food. And then if you are, let's say, with the communist bloc, there'll be a lot of difficulties in doing that. And then I think a lot of moving forward to right now, and then perhaps in the future, I think over the past few years, we also saw food has increasingly become part of geopolitical so-called weapon of leverage used by big powers to achieve diplomatic and then other so-called objectives, right? In the context of US trade war, China used food import or either food import or food ban as sort of bargaining chips. But then also, right, with smaller suppliers, food has, the access to Chinese market was used as sort of geopolitical bargaining chip as well. I guess when world became more divided, we are going to see more instances like this, which will bring far more so-called uncertainty or instability to the global food trade.
Yeah, so it's almost structural as a kind of a political, economic gravity or play that great powers may use in a situation of a divided world, unfortunately. And I think I'll come back to you because I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts on particular types of policy responses. Of course, China's dual circulation is one of great interest, in terms of how it's pivoting. I dare say Singapore's is another interesting policy response to where agronomically and technologically possible, our own nutritional self-sufficiency. Well, maybe to Madhu and Chukin. So what do you see, in terms of the role of technology and also of, be it for corporates and also of citizens, food citizens in shaping the future of food?
I can go first. I'll be quick. I think the technology, I had a conversation with someone who's this morning on intellectual property with someone. And it was interesting, in a very divided world, things like how licensing is done and how trade deals are made will be so critical. So actually, I think the role of governments, they're already significant, right, in terms of how people are fed. But I think it will be even more significant in a divided world where imagine the chicken and oil bans that we're seeing from Malaysia and Indonesia respectively. Imagine that happening constantly for various commodities, right? So if we do something, if that happens, then more governments, particularly food importing countries, will need to be able to be flexible and adaptive to this continued discontinuity in the food system. So I think that will be quite critical. And technology, in this case of licensing and more tech-based foods like proteins and so on, or vertical indoor farming, etc. These kinds of things will become a form of resiliency. They already are for Singapore, so we think about that a lot, but maybe that will become a model for other parts of the world as well. What is a bit of a concern for me in terms of technology and technologies that are being scaled up is often they're quite removed from land-based agriculture. And that requires, like, the reason why we have heirloom crops, and this because it got like, these are hundreds of years of human knowledge in cultivating these different varieties. It's a question of how much that knowledge is kept. I feel like you've got people like Robin Wall Kimmerer and other parts of the world talking about indigenous knowledge. But then when we talk about indigeneity in Southeast Asia, it's almost like a dirty word. It's like, all these people don't have the right set of skills or they don't have the right efficiencies, very fragmented. So there is this you started this question with mental models, Luke. I think we have a certain mental model that privileges technology and is like everything technology is, the best thing after sliced bread kind of a mentality that we tend to have, which is important because as I say, technology is critical for resilience. But as we know, all the best technologies are value neutral. Whether they are a force for good or bad depends on the value systems and the kinds of principles that go behind it. I think right now we are fetishizing our technologies and food too much. And we are not, to my point, we are really kind of like undervaluing our farmers and the people. And I think that's where the kind of work that City Sprouts, people who are doing work to connect people back to their food, is so critical. So, and it's not as if that's devoid of technology. You've got people like Ibner at Ground Up Initiative, who's using technology and maker spaces to connect people to food. So again, technology is value neutral here. It's important. And I think that we need to be able to work with it in a way that's really catalyzing and enabling the kind of change we want to see. Right now, I think what we are seeing as the change we want to see is food security. But I think the caution that I have is, if we think of food security as just yield or just, meeting some basic needs without understanding that actually our entire food system, our water, energy, the amount of energy we have, the water intensity of agriculture, and our biodiversity, all these critical inputs to the food system, that's longer term food security and resiliency. So it's not really a good to have. It's something that's so fundamental that if we miss it, we are not really building a very secure future for ourselves around food. That's my take.
Yes, well, thank you, Madhu. In fact, I think it's really how technology is necessary, but not sufficient. It's how does it fit into the model? And I think we're getting more questions here. One question that I don't think we're equipped to answer on the specific, farm change really speaks to the broader theme we're talking about, which is, what is the pathway to food security and sovereignty? Is it to throw technology at it and capital and use enterprise? Nothing wrong. I mean, it's just one way, or is another way to emphasize things like agroforestry, and raising species. So LKY-SPP is part of NUS. I was interested that there's another acronym for NUS called neglected and underutilized species. But anyway, over to you, Jikin, on so tell us, what's your vision on what the people side and social enterprise can contribute to the future of food sovereignty, food security?
Sure. In fact, we were talking about technology, right? We did toy with the idea of having a real life farm view, kind of gamified version of farming in a small scale perspective, right? So the vision that I shared earlier about encouraging and empowering households or communities to start their own small garden or edible garden at home or in their workplace or in their schools. We did toy with the idea of possibly using a platform where we could connect all these different players who are growing their own food and supplementing their own diet with what they grow, right? But at the same time, we understand not understanding the growth cycle of different crops might be challenging, and there will definitely be excess, and you won't be able to consume everything, or you might be lacking certain produce that you need to complement your own range of food. So we thought having a platform to connect these people and understanding what different communities are growing at different times and be able to barter or even possibly create like a retail platform would be an interesting way to supplement and complement whatever industrial and commercial farms are doing. And that could be a very interesting possibility that we could look at, and when we're talking about future of food. Yeah.
So it's interesting, and thinking in terms of imagery, I'm thinking of a mosaic, a web, not just a hierarchy or a first or last mile, but something decentered where, all the different players spatially and sectorally really come together. Not that it's a love fest, but it is that everyone is bringing something to the table, So I think we are going to wrap up soon. So may I invite panelists to think of any, concluding thoughts that we haven't touched on yet, and also a final call for any Q&As that may be coming up. All right. Yeah. So maybe can I pass the ball to Dr. Zhang first? But before that, let me say that I introduced Dr. Zhang and Madhu as my friends, but I didn't say anything about Chicken. Chicken's my friend, but my neighbor as well, because we live we live and work sort of in the same neighborhood space. So I also really think on the ground about how things can grow. So yeah, just to start wrapping us up, can I hand over to Dr. Zhang?
Okay. Thank you very much, Luke. I just have two quick points. The first one, I think we all mentioned throughout the webinar. The first is that the commodification of food should be resisted, rather, as Luke mentioned. More attention and awareness needed on the so-called multifunctionality of food system. Food is part of the culture, food is part of right, food is part of the security, and then the critical role of food systems in a sustainable future. And then the second is that individuals, like consumers like us, we all have a role to play in terms of developing responsible eating habit, cut waste, then eat light and healthy diet. With that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Hongzhou. Really at the 11th hour, we get some questions coming in. So Madhu, over to you. Lob the ball to you, and also tell me about wildcards. Since you mentioned some wildcards, I want to hear at least one or two in parting.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for really thought-provoking questions, as well as incredible contributions from Hongzhou and Jekin. I think the main thing for me is just grappling with a lot of these fault lines and interesting questions in food. There are all these interesting questions, but there is no space to really think about it, rather than be in these kinds of spaces where it's like a academic almost discussion. What we are trying to do is to bring together industry actors, people working in the space, and encouraging them to have these kinds of discussions, not just as a thought exercise, but how can it feed into developing agency, as Luke talked about. And in the questions we've heard, we've seen some really interesting points raised about the local farms that are being evicted while we have these 30 by 30. I was really hoping Jekin will speak to that, but so we didn't get to it. But I think there are these kinds of critical questions of what does it mean to have a just and regenerative protein system. I think the first point to Lastrina is a friend and she's raised this question. I think the main point I have to Las's question is we need to even understand what a just and regenerative protein system is from different points of view. So we've heard from Jekin about reconnecting people and really producing food systems that are value. Like, how can you value this the food, not just eat it? Whereas what Dr. Zhang has talked about is much more in this kind of macro big things that are quite hard for us as individuals to grapple with. But that is the reality. Like in the terms of trade, how certain ways in which the power dynamics are set out in the food system. If we don't think about it, then we're not going anywhere. So there is something about everyone who talks about and works in the food system has very unique vantage points and perspectives to bring in order to shape this vision of what is just and regenerative. And there are different elements that we already know. Like we know that hyper-localization of food systems, having a biodiverse food system is important. We know that affordability and good nutrition is critical. We also know that equity towards our smallholders is really important if we want to sustain our food systems, and not just smallholders in some far off rural areas, but also the people who are creating and producing food in our urban and peri-urban centers. So all of this is quite important. What I would encourage as my parting thought is let's build that together. I don't think there is this like silver bullet or easy answer. And that's what we are saying is, come, let's work together to shape this. And as with any form of power dynamic, it's really important as to who is brought onto that and who's left out of these conversations. And so far, what has been is that the big techs or the big companies tend to be the ones shaping the discourse and agenda. And I love that, for instance, Foodscape Collective, I was hosting a conversation where they were looking at what a community-led circular food economy in Singapore might look like. And I would love for those kinds of conversations to be happening much more, so that we are not just thinking in the abstract, but actually discovering our own personal and community level agency in shaping the food system. That's me. Peace out.
Awesome, Madhu. And I think that the key takeaway is that, we can also do our part, take our initiative to shape that, besides just floating in the food economy. And over to you, Chikin, on that note.
Yeah, I think Madhu summed it up really nicely. I think all parties need alignment, and societies need to buy into this idea of just and regenerative agriculture. Governments need to buy in. Businesses, organizations, and of course individuals need to buy in. I think in trying to build a more resilient and sustainable food system, I think there are a few paradoxes that we didn't really get a chance to talk about, but I think one of them being, consumers, we know how unsustainable our food systems are, but yet, there are certain barriers, and there are certain restrictions to how we can take action towards that. Things like price, things like consistent, reliable information that we can find, because we are bombarded by so many different sources every day about food, right? And which are reliable and trustworthy sources. I think we need to look into improved transparency from businesses, from governments, from different agencies. So I think all pistons have to be firing in order for us to really shape this together. And I think on a social and community level, really it's about empowering people, equipping them with the right mindset, with the right skills, with the right connections as well. And yeah, I think there is definitely hope. There's definitely exciting things ahead. Things take time. I think education, trying to get this whole mindset really instilled in people in the younger generation is important, and that's kind of what City Sprouts is striving and excelling at doing now. Yeah.
Thank you, Chikin. So really, we've started with the head and gone to the guts and really the ground of what's up in the food system. Where may we be going? And I think that by way of a very quick wrap up, and thanks for the indulgence of the organizers for giving us a bit more time. It's really a system. And I think that we are dancing around the fact in a way that there's this huge mechanism that is churning out food right now, but is it fit for purpose for people and planet, and so as we think of new trajectories, new additions, it is this big gorilla or what, choose your animal, and how do we renovate that? How do we transform an aircraft in flight? And I see that we have, in fact, some unanswered questions. So that's for many more panels to come. And just I think to plug some quick themes in closing. There's a question of agency. There's a question of how there's challenge, but it's also an opportunity, and not to say that in a trite way. And then I think there's also the takeaway that in maybe times of normalcy is the industry, but I think in post-normal times, I think that's where governments also have a lot of different policy attention and innovation, and will respond to whatever geopolitical landscape individual players have to deal with. And it's also about, if certain technologies or innovations need to be realized, if it's not the market mechanism, then how? And I think that's where the people sector is not a rounding error, but food citizens, who may really step up and define the future of food. And there's so much more we can talk about: the future of food and work, the future of nutrition, the future, in fact, of mariculture. Asia is very maritime, so I think let's continue the conversation next time, But meanwhile, a final plug, I sent a mysterious link. I happen to be the co-guest editor for a Food Futures special edition of the World Futures Review. And we're in trouble. Our editorial deadline was, I think, yesterday or today. We've got some entries. We would certainly benefit from more. So hopefully this session has edified you and inspired you as aspiring futurists to give us an abstract. I'm again interceding with the editors to give us more time. In this case, perhaps a month. So it's on you guys now to help write the future of food. So with that, thank you to my panelists, and I bring you back to Dr. Ani's good hands to close the session.
Thank you very much to the three panelists. And look, as I listen diligently, continue to the current practice that I always, indulge myself in the mind mapping. So the features of food actually, and of course, those highlighted in yellow are the sort of, key takeaways that I have. I think, if we end the session with more questions and answers, I think our job is really well done. There's a lot of, food for thoughts and a lot to digest from today's conversation. We talk about, we started off with food security from Dr. Zhang, and then we went into, some systemic gaps that we have. I really like, Madhu's inputs on who is left out from the conversations, right? And I think that is kind of then seamlessly, aligned with what Zekin's talk about. We often forget about who were behind the food that we eat, right? We always paid attention to the sort of taste, the appearance, but we kind of tend to forget about, who are behind this food. And I really miss the kampong that Zekins mentioned earlier about the tapioca that, his grandmother harvested in the morning and shared it with, the people in the kampong, and really miss those, time. And, and of course, Luke mentioned about the many questions that we have, but I'm pretty sure that together we can shape and influence the features of food. With that, I shall quickly wrap up the session and close the session. But before I do that, I do have a couple of, admin slides to go through. If you can bear with us for a quick 3 minutes, if you could help us, quickly scan the QR code, on screen, or click on the link in the chat to give us quick feedback, because we really would love to hear, your thoughts, your inputs on the features webinar sessions that we have, to just quickly, share your feedback. And if you could go to the next slides, please. I do have a couple, new initiatives to share and a couple of programs that we have. So yes, if you are keen to hear more about foresight and learn more about futures thinking, do sign up to our 2 upcoming programs. We have one in person from the 13th to 16th of September on our campus. And of course, for international friends, you cannot fly to Singapore, do join the online version of our Futures Masterclass, Foresight to Policy, that will be running from 18th of October to 8th of November. It's the live session is every Tuesdays from 2 to 6 p.m. Singapore time. And of course, we have early bird promotion from now until 16th September. We do also have 2 other open enrollment programs, one on the mastering behavior for a changing world, and then the other one is a professional certificate in public policy and administration. If you are keen to find out more about these programs, do scan the QR code on your screen now. Next slide, please. And yes, we do have the Festival of Ideas is coming back. This is, to celebrate our school's anniversary. This is the 2nd edition of the Festival of Ideas from 10 to 14 October. The theme is Asia at the Crossroads, a World Disrupted. So, feel free to come by our campus and really celebrate this 5-day festival with us. And of course, if you would like to find out more, do scan the QR code on your screen. And of course, I have the last slide, which is about connecting with us. If you'd like to reach out to any of the panelists, we would love to share their contacts with you, and feel free to reach out to us, if you'd like to do so. And that brings us to 6:30 on the dot. To really, I hope you don't mind to join me to thank all the three wonderful panelists, Dr. Zhang, Madhu, as well as Zakin. And of course, to thank our great moderator, Luke, to really bring us through this thought-provoking and very insightful conversation. With that, until I see you again in the next episode of Futures Forward webinar, please take care and have a great evening ahead, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.